Welcome back to the Deep Dive. For today's analysis, we are executing, well, a major geographical shift. We're setting aside the story of continental expansion in America for a moment and turning our gaze profoundly eastward. We are crossing the Pacific Ocean, shifting the geographical setting from the American South, a place, defined by recent civil war and reconstruction, to imperial China in the late 19th century.
It is perhaps the most radical journey we've tracked in this family history, yeah.
Hmm.
And it forces us to redefine what we mean when we talk about legacy and pioneering spirit. Our focus is on the Reverend Hampden Coit DuBose. He represents a crucial pivot point. He carried that deep-seated religious conviction, the very foundation the family built in America, and transported it thousands of miles away, devoting his entire adult life to the people of Soochow.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is really to understand the full scope of Hampden Coit DuBose's career. We want to focus on his nearly 4 decades, not just as a missionary or an author, but as a pioneering social reformer. Because he didn't just talk about faith, he fought a tangible, massive social evil on foreign soil. We need to understand the man, definitely, and the monumental crisis he faced in China.
Yeah, and what is truly fascinating about DuBose is how he embodies a different kind of American pioneer. I mean, we often visualize pioneers moving west, right? Clearing land, establishing economic footholds. Hampton was establishing spiritual and social footholds in a culture that was ancient, complex, and rapidly undergoing geopolitical upheaval. He dedicated decades to the people of China during a period that, well, fundamentally reshaped global power dynamics. It's pretty remarkable.
Okay, let's unpack the origins of this conviction then, because we really can't understand the man who became DuBose in China without first establishing the crucible that forged him, his roots in South Carolina.
Absolutely. Hampton Coit DuBose was born in Darlington, South Carolina back in 1845. And to appreciate his decision to leave, you really have to recognize the world he was born into, the immense trauma he experienced growing up. He was born just before the Mexican-American War, lived through the intensifying sectional crisis, and then, crucially, his formative years, his teens into early adulthood, were spent completely engulfed by the Civil War.
That timing is just,
Yeah.
it's everything, isn't it? He was a young man coming into his own while his entire society was collapsing around him.
Precisely. And the Civil War didn't just end in 1865. It ushered in the decade-long agony of Reconstruction, particularly in South Carolina. It was brutal. So for a young man trying to find his footing, the environment was defined by economic collapse, political instability, massive social upheaval. The established structures of his world were completely shattered. You had farmlands lying fallow, fortunes evaporated, and the future was just deeply uncertain. This era of immense hardship, though, it taught a deep lesson in resilience and, well, necessity.
And yet, amidst all this chaos, this total economic ruin at home, his spiritual framework held constant. Where did that structure come from?
It was deeply ingrained. His father, the Reverend Julius Jesse DuBose, was also a minister. So Hampton was raised in a home where faith wasn't just a Sunday ritual, it was the essential lens through which the world was understood. Service, discipline, conviction, these were non-negotiables. And we absolutely must connect this back to the ultimate family origin, the Huguenot heritage.
Ah, yes, the Huguenots. We've referenced that deep-seated heritage before, but maybe for listeners who aren't familiar, what exactly does being a Huguenot descendant imply about one's fundamental worldview?
Well, the Huguenots were French Protestants back in the 16th and 17th centuries. They faced intense religious persecution, which led to their mass exodus, the very migration that brought the DuBose family founder, Isaac, to America. So the core identity of a Huguenot descendant, even generations removed, is really defined by persecution, tenacity, and an unshakable adherence to conviction. Often in the face of immense worldly challenge, it's a lineage built on the idea that conviction is worth crossing oceans for, literally.
Okay, so Hampton is steeped in this heritage, a tradition of leaving everything for faith, and he's living through a catastrophic collapse at home. Given the vast need for rebuilding South Carolina during Reconstruction, why did he choose to leave the United States entirely? That seems like a huge leap.
It does, and that decision matured after his studies at Columbia Theological Seminary. While the need at home was undeniable, he felt a powerful, undeniable calling to the international field. But we also have to zoom out and look at the global historical context of the 1870s. This was arguably the height of what historians sometimes call the Great Century of Christian missions.
Right? It was an era of fervent, almost unstoppable global expansion of mission work, wasn't it?
Exactly. American and European churches weren't just focusing on local charity. They were seized by the conviction that the gospel had to be carried to every nation on earth. Driven by a kind of prophetic urgency and, frankly, improved global logistics like steamships. Mission boards were mobilizing massive resources. So Hampton's choice to leave wasn't just an isolated whim. It was him answering a massive, sweeping, internationally focused religious movement that really defined his generation in the church.
So he steps into that global mandate then. He made the monumental commitment to leave the economic despair of the South for the colossal unknown entity that was 19th century China.
He did. He answered the call, and in 1872, he set sail. And just think about what that journey entailed, even with steamships. This was not a quick flight. It was weeks, maybe months, long voyage across vast, often dangerous oceans. He was committing to a lifetime away from his family, his culture, the comfort of everything familiar. His primary modes of communication would be letters, that took months to cross the globe. This level of severance requires a profound, almost reckless commitment.
This transition brings us nicely to Section 2,
Yeah.
the arrival. So we have this young man from a post-war agrarian society with very localized customs arriving in 1870s imperial China. It's hard to overstate the magnitude of the culture shock he must have experienced.
Oh, absolutely. It genuinely would have been like stepping onto another planet. Or perhaps more accurately, stepping backward through thousands of years of accumulated tradition. Consider the contrast. Hampton came from a relatively young nation, scarred by recent conflict, focused on rapid industrialization and expansion. He arrives in China, a civilization defined by continuous history stretching back millennia, characterized by a complex, nuanced, and frankly rigid bureaucratic structure, and a deep philosophical tradition, Confucianism, Taoism, that informed every single layer of society.
So he wasn't just dealing with different food or clothing. He was dealing with an entirely different way of organizing reality, family, the state, everything.
Absolutely. The social norms, the emphasis on filial piety, the elaborate rituals of courtesy, the language barrier itself, it was all overwhelming. For an American used to directness and sort of democratic informality, navigating the hierarchies of imperial China, even as a foreigner, must have been a daily lesson in complexity. And the sheer density of population, the noise, the smells, everything was multiplied to a scale just unimaginable back in South Carolina.
And his base of operations was the legendary city of Soochow. What can you tell us about that specific location?
Right, Soochow, often transliterated today as Suzhou. That was his home for nearly 40 years. It's situated near Shanghai, and historically it was one of the most culturally significant and affluent cities in China. It has long been referred to as the Venice of the East because of its breathtaking network of canals and stone bridges. Really beautiful. It was the historical center of the silk trade and famous throughout the empire for its exquisite classical gardens, its poets, its scholars.
So he wasn't settling in some remote, poor, or easily ignored outpost. He was setting up shop right in the historical center of Chinese culture and wealth.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this presented both opportunity and immense challenge. Opportunity because it was a strategic center of commerce and intellect. Challenge because this highly cultured, ancient population was inherently skeptical, even maybe dismissive, of foreign ideas, particularly religious ones. They possessed their own robust philosophical and religious frameworks already. So for Hampden, integrating into Soochow meant facing a sophisticated culture that largely viewed the Western world as, well, crude and barbarian.
So establishing the mission was clearly a painstaking, decade-long process of gaining trust and mastering this ancient culture. Let's shift now into the substance of his work, Section 3. Decades of dedication. What was the central mechanism, the core of his life in Soochow?
The centerpiece, above all else, was the consistent daily act of preaching the gospel. Now, this might sound simplistic, but the reality of executing this daily for nearly 4 decades is just astonishing. The memorials written following his death, often from fellow missionaries who witnessed his life firsthand, confirm his incredible consistency. They note that he preached in Chinese almost daily for close to 40 years.
Wow. To maintain that kind of schedule for 4 decades, he had to achieve not just conversational ability, but real fluency. Mastery of the language sufficient to address complex theological or moral ideas.
Oh, absolutely. It requires a profound level of mastery. And keep in mind, he wasn't just learning Mandarin, which was the official court language. He likely had to contend with the local Soochow dialect, too, which would have been crucial for connecting with the everyday people, not just the literati or officials. Speaking daily means navigating idiomatic expressions, cultural references, complex tones, all while conveying a message that was fundamentally foreign to his listeners. This daily performance, it built credibility over time.
And it's proof, really, that he moved past being merely a guest and became integrated into the fabric of the community. And that integration is perhaps best signaled by how the local Chinese people referred to him.
That's right. He became so established, so familiar to the thousands of residents of Soochow that he was rarely referred to by his English name. He was simply known as DuBose, which is the localized Chinese phonetic rendering of DuBose. This is a critical historical marker. When a foreigner acquires a recognized and respected Chinese name in a local setting like that, it signifies a level of acceptance and ownership by the community that very few missionaries actually achieved. He wasn't just in Soochow. In a way, he became of Soochow.
That acceptance would have been absolutely essential, especially considering the political turbulence of the time. I mean, the period encompassed the Sino-French War, the Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion. Dubuque had to maintain credibility through immense civil and international unrest.
Absolutely right. The success of Debussy suggests that he maintained a local reputation for genuine care and perhaps a kind of neutrality during periods when anti-foreign sentiment was peaking. Sentiment often driven by political humiliation and colonial intrusion, you have to remember.
Mhm. Now, beyond the pulpit, his influence also extended through print. He was known as a prolific author. How did the written word amplify his mission in a culture that traditionally prized literacy and scholarly work so highly?
That's a great point. China had a massive and historically literate population, unlike many other regions of the world targeted by missions at the time. DuBose recognized that print media was a powerful, scalable tool for dissemination. It could reach people he couldn't speak to directly, so he dedicated significant effort to writing and publishing numerous Christian books, theological primers, evangelistic tracts, all specifically composed in Chinese.
What kind of content were these tracts typically? Was he writing lengthy theological treatises or more practical guides?
Primarily, they seem to have been practical, accessible materials designed to disseminate his message widely and affordably. Think of them like pamphlets or short books. They often address specific moral or religious questions, maybe utilizing traditional Chinese narrative styles or literary devices to make the foreign concepts a bit more palatable. And these weren't just distributed locally in Soochow. They were often carried by local agents, sometimes called colporteurs, along the vast canal networks. This ensured his influence traveled far beyond the immediate city limits, reaching villages and other urban centers.
So a sophisticated communicator then, using the daily spoken word for personal connection and the printed word for mass reach. Very strategic.
Hmm.
But we need to transition now to what might be the most powerful and unique aspect of his life, the Great Social Crusade, his fight against opium.
Yes. This is where DuBose transitions from being a devoted missionary into really a towering figure of social reform. And it's a direct consequence of what he witnessed daily in Soochow. To understand his crusade, we first have to deeply understand the devastating reality of the 19th century opium crisis in China. It was catastrophic.
We often hear the term opium crisis, but what was the specific structure of this catastrophe? How exactly was it crippling Chinese society on such a scale?
Well, the crisis was a colossal man-made disaster. It was primarily fueled by a catastrophic imbalance of international trade. British merchants, trying to compensate for the massive amounts of Chinese tea and silk they were purchasing, began shipping vast quantities of opium, primarily grown in British India, into China. And despite imperial prohibition, this trade just exploded, especially after the Opium Wars forced China to legalize it, essentially.
So it was a massive, internationally entrenched economic system designed basically to profit from Chinese addiction.
Exactly. And the consequences were devastating on every level. Socially, opium addiction destroyed millions of lives. It fractured families, led to extreme poverty, drained local economies. People would sell their land, their possessions, sometimes even their children, just to feed their habit. It was horrific. Nationally, the constant outflow of silver to pay for the opium destabilized the entire imperial economy. And DuBose wasn't reading about this in some distant report. He was witnessing the degradation, the misery, the ruin right outside his mission door every single day.
That kind of daily suffering, face to face, it must have required a moral response that went way beyond abstract spiritual teaching.
Yeah.
What was DuBose's personal moral perspective on this issue?
His stance was absolutely uncompromising. He viewed opium not just as a vice, but as a soul and body killing evil. That specific phrasing is key. It shows he didn't separate the physical destruction from the spiritual consequence. For him, true faith demanded action against this palpable, tangible evil that was actively destroying the lives and communities he was there trying to serve. It was a crisis of both physical health and, frankly, national sovereignty for China.
That distinction is huge. It means his commitment couldn't just be about converting individuals one by one. He felt he had to challenge the systemic injustice that created the misery in the first place. That's a huge leap from being a typical preacher to becoming a social reformer.
It is the defining feature of his legacy, I'd argue. He understood that you could not truly preach a message of salvation or hope to a population that was simultaneously being crushed by an internationally sponsored drug epidemic. It wouldn't ring true. So he became an extremely active voice against this system. He
Mhm.
transitioned into overt activism. He wrote numerous articles, not just about religion, but specifically condemning the opium trade. He gave fiery, persuasive public speeches as do-boo, psi-demanding intervention.
But this must have put him in an incredibly precarious position, surely. As a Westerner, he was fundamentally challenging the interests of other powerful Western nations, Great Britain chief among them, who were profiting immensely from this trade. Did he face resistance or danger from the foreign commercial community?
He certainly faced significant political navigation. It was complicated. His position was often unpopular with the foreign commercial interests, especially in the big treaty ports like Shanghai. They likely viewed him as interfering with legitimate trade, as they defined it. However, his mission was Presbyterian, primarily American funded. This perhaps gave him a degree of political distance from the most aggressive players, like the successors to the British East India Company.
And his commitment manifested not just in words, but in actual organizational leadership. How effective was the organizational front he helped establish?
Right, this is the operational side of his crusade. He was instrumental in helping to organize one of China's first and most influential formal anti-opium societies. While precise records can be a bit tricky to track down for every local initiative, his work often connected with broader efforts like what became the International Reform Bureau based in Shanghai. But his primary focus always seemed to remain local grassroots organization right there in Soochow. The goal wasn't just moral persuasion, it was about systemic change, advocating for the imperial government to strictly enforce its own prohibitions and, crucially, for foreign powers to cease importation.
What specifically made his organization, or the ones he was part of, so influential? Was it leveraging his Western status for legitimacy? Or was it more the purity of his moral argument?
I think it was a combination, but the purity of the moral argument was absolutely key, particularly among the Chinese populace and those reform-minded officials. Think about it. As a Westerner who was openly condemning a primarily Western-driven trade, he possessed a unique kind of moral authority. He couldn't be easily dismissed as merely a Chinese official resisting foreign goods out of protectionism. He successfully used his position to bridge that divide, showing that not all foreigners supported the destructive trade. This allowed the movement to gain traction and much-needed political visibility.
So his leadership in the Anti-Opium League essentially cemented his status in China then. It moved him beyond being simply a religious functionary.
It absolutely did. His fight against the soul and body-killing evil, as he called it, earned him immense, lasting respect. And not just from Christians. Respect from both the Chinese people, including non-Christian officials and scholars, and the ethical element within the Western community itself. He wasn't just preaching abstract salvation, he was actively contributing to the physical and social welfare of the nation he had adopted. This solidified his reputation as a vital social reformer dedicated to the common good, not just narrow sectarian interests. He used his platform, his identity as a do-bose, to advocate for real systemic change that ultimately did contribute, alongside many Chinese efforts, to the imperial edicts against opium cultivation and consumption in the early 20th century.
So he fought this massive battle, spiritual, social, and political, for nearly 40 years in Soochow. Let's move to our final section, Section 5, the legacy of a life's work. When Hampden Coit DuBose died, what was the response from the community he had adopted for so long?
Hampden died in 1910. He had dedicated nearly 38 years, essentially his entire adult life, to the city and people of Soochow. The records we have indicate a deep and widespread reverence at his passing. His death wasn't just mourned by the small mission community, it was genuinely felt as a loss broadly across the city. I mean, the sheer longevity of his service created a connection that transcended all the political instability and cultural barriers of the time. He had literally aged and spent his most productive years entirely among them.
He became a permanent fixture, didn't he? Almost an institution unto himself. But as you mentioned earlier, perhaps the greatest legacy wasn't just the work he completed himself, but the commitment he managed to pass on, that multi-generational dedication.
Yes, that multi-generational echo is really powerful, and it brings the story full circle in a remarkable way. The conviction Hampden carried across the Pacific was successfully internalized and inherited by his children. Specifically, his son, Palmer Coit DuBose, followed directly in his father's footsteps. He also became a missionary in China, This established a remarkable DuBose family legacy of service there, spanning into the next century. It proves that Hampden's devotion wasn't just some personal anomaly, but became an inherited tradition.
That raises a fascinating philosophical point for you, our listener, tracking this family history with us. If we connect Hampden's journey all the way back to the very origins of the family in the 1680s, it frames his life as a powerful and a remarkable completion of the family story, doesn't it?
It truly does. And this, I think, is the ultimate takeaway of this particular deep dive. We trace the family's roots back to Isaac DuBose, the original Huguenot refugee. Isaac carried his deep faith across the vast Atlantic Ocean, fleeing persecution to build a new life, securing freedom, and establishing the foundation of the family's presence in America.
Right. And then 5 generations later, Hampden Coit DuBose takes that exact same tenacious Huguenot faith.
And he carries it across the even wider Pacific Ocean. But with a different goal, perhaps. Isaac sought to secure his faith and build his own life. Hampden took that inherited faith and dedicated his life entirely to the service of others, in a land utterly foreign to him. Such a powerful parallel. One generation crossing the Atlantic for the right to believe, and a later generation crossing the Pacific out of a sense of duty to serve. It demonstrates the enduring nature of that founding conviction across centuries and continents.
It really speaks volumes about conviction triumphing over geography, doesn't it? This story transforms the family narrative from solely one of American continental settling to a story of profound international dedication and reform.
And what stands out so clearly is the complete integration of the spiritual and the social in Hampden's work. You can't separate them. The missionary work, the daily preaching, and the social reform, the fight against the soul and body-killing evil of opium were utterly inseparable for him. He demonstrated that faith and direct, tangible action to improve the physical and social well-being of a community are, or at least can be, inextricably linked. He left the social turmoil of Reconstruction-era South Carolina only to dedicate himself to fighting the massive societal crisis gripping the Chinese nation. That level of dedication required both incredible physical resilience and immense moral clarity.
A truly global journey defined by service and reform, giving rise to one of the most compelling figures in this family's history. DuBose of Soochow, thank you for guiding us through the life of Hampden Coit DuBose today.
My pleasure. It's a testament really to how far conviction can carry a person. A remarkable life.
And as we reflect on Hampden's global mission, think about this dichotomy for a moment. While one branch of the DuBose family was looking across the Pacific Ocean, driven by this global missionary mandate, another branch was simultaneously continuing the domestic pioneer journey, seeking new land and opportunity in America's developing territories. Join us next time as we return to the States to tell the story of the DuBose family's other westward expansion. We'll contrast the global servant with the domestic settler. See you then.